history segment that goes over all your favorite games. Welcome to Nintendo 101.
Come on. Dang it! Whew. Hey there, my name's Balrog, and as you can tell, I love Nintendo. Ask Wario, he can tell you. Ain't that right? Now, despite being an adult, I still fully embrace my inner child with pretty much everything I do. I mean, I am all grown up, but it's still nice to have these little things around. However, there was one series that really helped me become the gamer I am today. Fzero. So personally, I believe that the best way I can go over the history of this series is through my own personal experiences playing the game as a kid. So, story time.
The year was 1999. It was my 6th birthday, and as I opened my gifts at Pizza Hut, I like pizza, okay? I got a new Nintendo racing game. Now, being a fan of Nintendo and Mario Kart, I knew I wouldn't be disappointed with this F-Zero X. But what I got instead was a crash course into one of the hardest games ever created. This game was my rite of passage into the realm of hardcore games, and when I showed off my skills to my friends, I felt like a complete badass.
Whoa. Anyway, so what is this F-Zero series all about, and how could a racing game be one of the hardest games that I've ever played? Well, let's go back in time a few decades and find out.
So our story begins in 1990, with the launch of the Super Famicom, or as we know in English, the SNES. You see, Nintendo was about to enter something called the 16-bit era, an era that showcased the true potential and processing power of home consoles. But there were already two competitors, the PC Engine by NEC and Hudson, yes, that Hudson, and the Sega Mega Drive. You may know these as the TurboGrafx-16 and Sega Genesis. Add in their impressive backlogs of games to the equation, and Nintendo knew they had to prove themselves day one. And what they did, oh, what they did, was simply mind-blowing.
Now, to avoid a bunch of technical mumbo-jumbo, I'll just put it plain and simple. There were 8 modes used for video output on the system, which would specify the palette as well as the amount of layers that a game would have. But the last one, famously called Mode 7, could rotate background layers thanks to this fancy algorithm and putting parameters for each scan line. In English, this meant a 3D effect to games, but to consumers, this meant a gaming revolution. And of course, cheesy 90s commercials. I mean, who doesn't love those?
Prepares you for the amazing new Super Nintendo entertainment yourself. Whoa!
Yeah.
That's fast!
Alright, so to sum this up, F-Zero was essentially a showcase of what this Mode 7 could do, as well as a launch title alongside Super Mario World, which even used Mode 7 a bit itself. But what's even more interesting than the graphics was the kind of game they ended up making, obviously being far different than your normal racer. Well, without further ado, let's talk about the game itself. So the story here, kindly put as a comic in the manual, is quite simple. In the year 2560, rich people were bored and wanted entertainment. So what's the first thing that would come to your mind? Maybe an amusement park? Some new TV shows? Oh, I know, how about a petting zoo? That sounds freaking adorable. Well, these guys thought, how about we make a lightning-fast Grand Prix race where people in hover cars kill each other to pursue fame and fortune? It's genius, right? Anyway, there's 4 characters to choose from. Pico, the alien, Dr. Stewart, the ladies' man, Goro, the crook, and Captain Falcon, the bounty hunter. Of course, story doesn't really play a role in this game since this is a racing game, but the extra little backgrounds were a pretty nice touch. Not to mention hilariously cheesy.
But of course the question on your mind isn't the story, it's what made this game such a radically different racer. Well, like a pizza, the best way to explain F-Zero is by putting each slice of the gameplay in separate parts. Care to do the honors, Wario? On second thought.
So number 1 is probably the most obvious, the 3D effect. This may not look like much by today's standards, but these amounts of 3-dimensional detail were unheard of back in the day. The worlds really felt like they were moving with you, the backgrounds were really nice to look at, and draw distances using different sized sprites was actually a really good idea. Things just looked a lot less disorienting than other racers at the time, which looking back at those, was really an accomplishment in itself. Alright, number 2 is the speed. Geez, just the thought of going 400 kilometers per hour in a video game is pretty mind-blowing. turns come at you fast, the speed of the cars makes driving a bit wild, and the boost, oh the boost. It's a crazy feeling, flying past ships already going a bajillion miles an hour. But number 3 really helped drive the feeling of speed home, the controls. Each of the 4 vehicles may have their pros and cons, and all feel very distinct from each other, but the way that the ships react to your D-pad movement are really something to behold. With most drivers, even the slightest tap will send you swerving to one side of the track, just because of the ridiculous speed you'll be going at.
At first they may feel a bit floaty, but after lots of practice, they become some of the tightest and satisfying controls I've ever seen in a racing game. Even though there's only 4 racers, each one feels radically different in terms of acceleration, speed, and boost, to the point that it actually feels like a different game with every single one. Now that's what you call some replayability.
Alright, number 4 are the obstacles. Whether it's avoiding mines, running into other racers, or even rough patches in the course, you always have something you need to worry about. But this is also where the speed comes into play. These obstacles are coming at you in a fraction of a second, which means you gotta have fast reflexes not to be constantly slowed down. And if you slow down in Fzero, it's a pain in the ass to catch up.
But there is one obstacle I'm forgetting. The bane of my existence, the cause of 50% of my childhood nightmares, the hardest enemy I've ever fought in a video game. The walls. What, were you expecting some huge monster or something?
Oh god, the walls. This was what really pissed me off as a kid. It was like racing in Cavity Sam's intestines, but it made you get good at the controls and fast. You had to drift correctly. You had to be sure not to hit other players. You had to boost at a spot where you had good control. Putting barriers in this game really made you soak in the track design, and be extra careful when you saw obstacles approaching. Sure, it may be trial and error for some, but that's just the arcade-like nature of the game. They want you to keep coming back and master each track. I mean, what fun would it be if you got everything the first time? There's no point to come back. But luckily, the game gives you a bit of a break with number 5, the damage meter. It was okay if you skid across an edge a few times, hit a couple mines, or even bump into exploding racers. These things would only take a tiny sliver of health from you. I mean, Nintendo had to have some leniency since you're going so darn fast, but if you make a huge mistake like hitting a wall too fast, you'll ricochet off the walls, which could easily take half of your health. It was mostly just an ultimatum from the game being like, hey, don't be too careless now.
Now luckily, you can regenerate at certain spots in the track, but this will only give you about a quarter of your health if you're in a hurry. You stick around and do the whole thing, and that'll cost you the race. Not to mention, falling off the track will instantly kill you, so be sure no one's around to bump you off if you're going on a ramp or something. You die in Fzero, and you have to do the track all over again. And I know no one wants to do that just because they're trying to shave half a second off their time.
And that's not the only way you can lose either, which leads me to our last slice, scores and ranks. As I said before, it's essential you don't fall behind in these races. Every time you finish a lap, the rank continues to go higher and higher and higher until you can't make it to the next lap if you're not in 3rd place or better. However, the game throws another curveball at you. Other players can still race, keeping your heart racing if you make one single mistake. The game starts blaring alarms at you if you're behind, and I don't know, it always gave me this rush of adrenaline just to survive the next lap. It really made the tedium of doing 5 laps go away somehow, something that other racing games really have trouble doing for me. But if you mess up, don't worry about it. You have 2 extra ships to keep you going in each cup's 5 tracks. Your score even increases the better you do in each race, and if you get 10,000 points, an extra life comes up.
So let's piece all this together. The awesome 3D visuals, the sheer amount of speed, the ranks, the obstacles, the controls. It was just a feast for the senses. The game may seem simple at first, but the constant clash of information always kept me at the edge of my seat. Add in a classic soundtrack, 4 difficulty levels, and different pathways for said difficulties, and you got an experience you won't soon forget. And if you're angry at games like me, broken controllers.
But unfortunately, the game had 2 problems that really held it back. The lack of multiplayer and in-game saves. The multiplayer was understandable since the game was showing off the SNES's hardware, but there is no excuse for this frustrating save problem. Now before you think, oh well, Mario Kart didn't have saves either, Fzero was just a way harder game, which usually meant you'd be replaying tracks a lot more. I'm sure I'm not the only one who had to go do their homework or go to bed or something, only to lose all their progress on that cup. Whew, good thing Virtual Console versions save your progress, huh?
So as you could imagine, Fzero sold millions of copies worldwide, and even inspired series like Wipeout and... It even got on the Nintendo Player's Choice in 1996. So, what's the best thing to do with a rapidly growing franchise? Lots and lots of sequels.
The first planned sequel wasn't anything special. It was a Virtual Boy version called Zero Racers, which got canned because Virtual Boy was a piece of garbage that got the father of the Game Boy fired. Fired! It really breaks my heart. However, the second sequel to F-Zero was planned on the SNES, featuring improved graphics, new vehicles, and new tracks. But Nintendo had another idea in mind. They decided to release it on something called the Satellaview, or the BSX, which was an add-on to the Super Nintendo.
Now I could make an episode just on the Satellaview, but I'll give you the simplified version. It was a video game broadcasting service that would only be on at certain times during the day, thanks to the magic of satellite radio. Despite costing 33,000 yen just to buy a tuner if you didn't have one, another 15,000 yen to buy the Satellaview, and even more monthly fees, the thing did pretty darn well in Japan. Beats me how.
This machine would have different playable games every week, a lot being remakes of NES games like Legend of Zelda and Wario's Woods. Along with playing the game, some games would also have an announcer talking to you as you play, hence why you can only play the game during those 2 to 3 specific hours. Now to this day, I still find that awesome, hence why I'm a huge Bastion fan. Anyway, back on track. There were 2 F-Zero games released on this service, called BS F-Zero Grand Prix 1 and 2. Before you start laughing at the title, BS stands for Broadcast Satellite. It was pretty much smacked on every title on the service. The first BS F-Zero was pretty much an improved version of the original, with new vehicles and an extra track added in. And unfortunately, the other one was the cancelled remains of the Super Nintendo sequel, with only 1 cup in it. Kinda disappointing for anyone who wants to play it, since the Satellaview is long gone, but it looked pretty darn fun back then.
But who cares if it was cancelled? By this time, the N64 version had already been announced. That's right, F-Zero was about to enter the third dimension, made by the geniuses who made Wave Race 64. This game would be called F-Zero X, the first racer ever to have 30 players on screen at a blistering 60 frames per second. Now that's just rad.
So the story here makes even less sense than the first game. After the original sport was canned for being too deadly and dangerous, it was revised in F-Zero X by being even more deadly and dangerous. You can attack other ships, it's way easier to crash to your death, and there's even a mode where all you do is kill the other players. I don't even. But hey, it sure works in favor of the new content, huh?
But now you're probably wondering, what exactly has improved from the original? Well, pretty much everything. This is one of those games that takes every little detail from its predecessor and improves on it. But now I'm conflicted about how to talk about F-Zero X. I mean, this was my first game in the series, so obviously my personal experiences are different than people who played the original. But at the same time, I went back and played the original, so I obviously do know these differences. You know what, I'm just gonna give you both. So here's F-Zero X, from the perspective of a 6-year-old and from an F-Zero veteran.
Where to begin? So after picking my cup and character, the first thing I thought when I played this was, oh my god, look how many racers there are! I mean, I was a big Mario Kart player, so going from 8 racers on screen to 30 was a really big jump. Also, after playing the original, I noticed that the tracks were wider to accommodate this change, which is nice since I always used to bounce all over walls like it was going out of style or something.
Now you would think that because of this you wouldn't run into other players as much, but oh no, it's even more common now, especially since you're given side and spin attacks to knock your enemies out of submission. Not to mention, enemy racers can also be destroyed by other players, so it always gave me this sense of urgency seeing the racer count slowly go down. It's pretty intense.
The second thing that caught my eye as a kid were those perilous jumps, hills, and tunnels. Just when you start focusing and catching up on the leader, the track chucks something crazy at you, and by the time you realize what's happening, you're already in 20-somethingth place. It was also around this time that I started realizing these tracks can't be beaten the first time. I wasn't in Mario Kart anymore, I can't just breeze through levels. I have to play them again and again and again, and learn every nook and cranny that comes at me. And hey, the game was fun enough that it didn't really bother me that much. But for F-Zero fans, this would be the way that the series evolved in the 3D. These kinds of obstacles were definitely more treacherous, changing the danger of the tracks from just sharp turns and jumps.
Oh, and Rainbow Road was also one of the tracks, called Psychedelic Experience. I have to say, that's one of the biggest heart attacks a game has ever given me, especially since it took out the guardrails. It's a hard one.
But the third difference was something I couldn't notice till I played the original. The rules. Instead of 5 laps with ranks slowly going higher, there's 3 laps with no disqualifications. Instead of getting a single-use boost every lap, boost now takes your health, so it becomes risk-reward for the player. But to me, the most helpful addition was the amount of extra lives depending on the play difficulty level. Now these may not sound like much at first, but like the original, each slice of the pizza counts. Less laps meant more retries on courses. Using those health draining boosts increased the game's tension, and more lives meant less controller chucking. The game certainly didn't get any easier, but these features definitely make the game more forgiving and accessible. Alright, so the last thing that caught my eye as a kid were the variety in modes. Not only was there a Grand Prix, but there was also the practice mode, where you could practice on any track in the game, Time Attack, where you could face against your own ghost for the best possible time, the Death Race, where you literally try to kill all other competitors as fast as you can, and Versus Battle, where you could play with up to 3 other friends split screen, all still at a buttery smooth 60 frames per second. Every mode just had its own distinct charm, despite most of them being a standard for a game of that genre.
But my favorite mode by far was the unlockable X Cup, a random track generator that can pretty much throw any curveball at you. Some can be cakewalks, some can be ridiculously hard, and some could have hilarious curves that chuck 20 players off the map. This gave the game an unlimited amount of replayability, and for years I ran from the bus to go home and play it. As you can tell, I wasn't really the social type in my class.
Now as awesome as this game sounds, there were 2 glaring faults in the game: the graphics and the music compression. You see, Nintendo wanted to set the bar for racing games in terms of speed and overall smoothness, but by doing that, they pretty much sacrificed everything else on screen. Everything in this game is just very low poly. The hovercrafts look very simple, there's almost no backgrounds to speak of besides a building or 2, and even the textures of said buildings look terrible. Luckily, you're going so fast that you only see these for a split second, but looking back, they've aged really badly.
As for the music, don't get me wrong, this is one of the best tracks on the N64. It's just that the quality isn't so hot. Luckily, even though these tracks were basically turned mono, they added these awesome stereo sound effects that really immerse you even more, so it doesn't really sound all that bad. But the announcer.
You got boost power! Yeah! Not quite on lap! Too bad! You lost your machine!
God, could they have compressed that any more? Come on, Nintendo, he sounds like he's underwater with his tongue sticking out. I stand by that. Here, let me try that really fast. See? What did I tell you?
Luckily, neither of these hurt the experience too much, especially since the game's not focused on these things. This is what leads me to one of my main thoughts about F-Zero X, its charm. What I find really intriguing about this game is how it's great without parts that usually make a game great. If Mario 64 or Ocarina of Time had low poly generic graphics, a part of its charm would go down significantly. I mean, who'd want to play in an open world if it looked like complete garbage? But in F-Zero X, none of that really seemed to matter, and it broke Nintendo's usual standard of a lovable world. Which is why, instead of making a sequel, Nintendo made a kick-ass expansion pack.
So before I tell you about this awesome pack, I have to tell you about a little something called the N64 disk drive. You see, before the N64 released, Nintendo had plans to make a disc-based peripheral for their system, mostly to increase its data storage. In fact, a lot of games like Kirby 64 and Paper Mario were developed with the drive in mind. But there's a reason you've never heard about this system before. It sucked.
Unfortunately, the N64 DD got delayed until 1999 when Nintendo was like, oh screw this, we're just gonna release it with no games on it. And it sold 15,000 units in Japan and failed hard. But hey, Nintendo knew it would suck and made the system mostly mail-in order, so it wasn't a terrible loss. For them. I mean, this all sounds like a huge gaming tragedy. What about those poor lost games, with no system to lead their way? Well, luckily, most of them got ported to the N64 after the 50,000th delay, but other games weren't so lucky. Like Fire Emblem 64, Super Mario 64 2, and Final Fantasy 7. Oh god, it even kills me to mention it. But the F-Zero expansion kit was one of the 9 games to see the light of day. So what did this thing have exactly? Well, I'll tell you plain and simple. 12 tracks, a car editor, and a level editor. Sounds like a perfectly decent pack if you ask me. Some of these new tracks were also really hard, as in paper-thin tracks with no boundaries hard, so hardcore fans were kept busy once again. The car editor was also really cool, but since there were only pre-made parts, it's not really anything that special. But the track editor, oh god, this thing was practically what Nintendo used to make the original game. It had pretty much every set piece found in the entire game's code. Not to mention you could put these tracks together and make your own cup, something not used again until the Japan-only F-Zero Climax on the Game Boy Advance. This expansion kit was pretty much any fan's dream, so it's too bad the N64DD never made it to the US.
But luckily, this was far from the end for F-Zero. Years later, 3 Game Boy Advance games, a GameCube game, an arcade machine, and even an anime would spawn from this series. But that story is for another time. In the meantime, track down any F-Zero game and just lose yourself to it. Go with those breakneck speeds and just embrace the feeling of escaping from the real world. And in the end, that's what gaming is all about, isn't it? As for me, I got a real car to drive. So in the meantime, this is Balrog signing out, and until next time, I was gonna say something cool, but I can't really think of anything at the moment, so I'll get back to you on that one. Later, bros.
Hey guys, thanks for watching. For more videos, be sure to click that like button and that subscribe button, and tell all your friends. And as you can hear by the music, the next 101 will be on Pokemon Ruby and Sapphire. If you want your Pokefix now though, check out my friend Jimmy's review on these games. It's really good. I also have a second channel for vlogging and Q&A, as well as a Facebook and Twitter, so if you'd like to know me personally, you can do so. Okay, I'm almost done. For people wondering where the Game Shark went, his presence is exclusive to the Earthbound videos, so he will return in Mother 3 in the near future. So until next time, check out my other Nintendo 101s, and I'm out for real now. Goodbye!